Hello, back by popular demand. Today we're going to do another R tutorial looking at bar graphs and facet wrapping. And this comes off of a request and a comment on a previous video that asks, when looking at your data set, is it possible to plot graphs for height, wet weight, moisture, etc. all at once without having to change the code little by little for all the results? And the short answer is yes, and stick around and we're going to get through to that today. All right. So what we're going to want to load are your packages, tidyr, ggplot2, reshape, and the tidyverse in general. So make sure you have those loaded. I want to have my data field, my global environment cleared, just good practice. And we're going to load in our data set. So up front, we have a lot. We have both above ground and below ground data, our accessions, our treatments, and our measurements across the columns here. Today we're only going to look though at the above ground portion. If we're going to assess the average height, wet weight, dry weight, and average moisture all in one plot, we only want to look at the above ground portion. So that means we need to filter our data. So calling on that data set, we're filtering the data and we're saying portion referring to the column that says portion. So if your treatment or other columns that you have in your data delineated other ways, you need to call on that specific column. Double equal sign, and then in quotes, what you're trying to filter or subset to. So running that, now our dry data set only shows the above ground data, primed and ready. However, everything's in a wide format. So in order to appropriately fit our data into one graph without having to change minute details for every single column, we need to pivot our data.
Pivot! Pivot! Pivot!
So we also need to specify the particular columns that we're going to focus on. So dry 2, we're making a new data set. Pivot longer is part of tidyr. Pivot longer takes a wide data set and shifts it to a long format. We're saying in that data set, we want to look at average height, average dry weight, and average moisture. So we already have our dry data set. Subsetting that for dry data set 2, we can see dry 2 consists of accession, treatment, height, wet weight, dry weight, average moisture. Now what we want to do is pivot this data so average height, wet weight, dry weight, and moisture are all in one column stacked on top of each other. So using pivot longer, we're able to take the width, shift it vertically in our dry 2 data set on average height, average dry weight, and average moisture. Run that. We can now see what was once wide now is 24 rows across our columns. We're going to ignore this average wet weight. It put our variables that we're looking at into a column called name. So height, dry weight, moisture, and then values are here. So those correspond with the measurements for that accession and that treatment. Now, in order to plot that data, we're going to use ggplot data equals dry 2, because that's that data set. The aesthetic, we want our x-axis to be our treatment, our y-axis to be our value, and we're going to fill the color by its name. Since we're going to be doing a bar plot, we're going to use bar, and you have to have stat identity so it knows it goes by the name and your values and what you put up above. This is where we need to start separating our columns, or at least our data from each other, because without position dodge, you're going to have a stacked bar chart. With position dodge, it's going to separate them and put all the individual measurements next to each other. Then with Facet Grid, we're going to be able to put our data into a grid, and that way we can have the wet weight and the dry weight and the height right next to each other without being in the same plot. They're going to have their own individual plot, name by treatment. Scales are free, so that way the y-axis is adjusted accordingly to the data, because our numbers and values for each data set are going to be slightly different. And then theme classic to remove those grid lines in the background. That brings us to a plot like this. We got one column by treatment, and then this y-axis is by the name, so dry weight, height, and moisture. And we can compare on their own individual scales, say the average moisture with fertilizer versus no fertilizer, the average height with fertilizer versus no fertilizer, and the average dry weight with and without. So that's a quick crash course on how to use facet wrapping or facet grids to your advantage, and that way you can fit all of your data into one concise plot without having to copy and paste and change minute details for multiple plots. So I will link in the description the ggplot 2 cheat sheet, as well as a video that I used to help me thoroughly understand the pivot longer, which is part of the dplyr package and the tidyverse. So if you have any questions, list them below, and I listen to your comments, and I can try a specific video if you're looking for something else. All right. Thank you.